Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hello. How are you today? I am fine. Hey, good morning, everybody. How are you doing? It is Friday, May 31st, 2024. End of the month. Time for a new everything. Time for a new show. Time for a new jail cell for Donald Trump, although I don't anticipate that coming anytime soon. But yes, it's Friday, and we feel forced to do another show because there's not very much news. Nothing has happened. But I thought you might like to come by and discuss the fact that nothing has happened. Yes, Donald Trump convicted on all 34 counts, so that ends the speculation about whether or not it would be necessary to find unanimity among a jury that were not willing to convict him of each of the underlying predicate crimes, I guess. Or would they just agree that a crime had been committed and a crime had been covered up, and so therefore they were willing to fight? It doesn't matter. All of it. Every single one. And all the last couple of days that we've been hearing about that the defense was pinning their hopes for a hung jury on the fact that one juror once smiled when J.D. Vance came in the room or something like that. And apparently there was a little bit more than that. There was, nodding in agreement along with, I forget which witness it was who was dismantling or attempting to dismantle Michael Cohen, but none of it. It was all for naught. Unanimous decision on all 34 counts. Trump is a convicted felon, and everybody gets to celebrate appropriately. Now, is he in jail right now? No. Will he receive prison time at all? Nobody knows for sure. Lots of disagreement on that. In all likelihood, the court will be very reluctant to be the first one to try to figure out how do you put a former president with Secret Service protection in jail. There's jail time attached to these convictions. You can get sent to prison, I think I saw 4 years for all of that. But everyone seems to think that it would be much more likely that he would be sentenced to probation of some kind. Not that that's nothing. I wondered whether it might restrict his travel schedule during the upcoming busy campaign season. But I don't know. I'm not certain how they'll handle it. There's lots of writing about it, speculating about it. And in all of these various write-ups or discussions on TV, radio, podcasts, what have you, it's always interesting to see them refer to these as his first offense, which they are not. Of course, he's offended a lot of people. And is it his first criminal offense? Well, I guess so. It's his first criminal conviction, but he's been found, of course, liable in New York courts for defamation of E. Jean Carroll. But perhaps more to the point, there have been cases against him and the Trump organization and finding him. Were those criminal cases, the fraud cases that barred him from running any charities or serving on the board of any charities in the state of New York? I mean, that's got to count for something as well. Might not be in the same category. And of course, everybody also knows that there are 3 other criminal trials pending against him. Although, as we do in this country, innocent until proven guilty. Although if you're Donald Trump, you just say you're innocent even after you've been proven guilty. So, par for the course there. Late breakfast here today. We're having a lazy day, just enjoying the convictions and drinking the coffee while on the air, in case you want to hear. Delicious. There it is. Actually, we were in a rush today as, I don't know, things were just behind schedule. So it's not even the good stuff from Judy Vincent out in Hawaii, which still lasts, by the way, still some around. And stretching it out slowly. This is quick instant coffee just to get us up and on the air. So, let's get to it. There's a large collection of stories out there with various hot takes. And perhaps, maybe the most efficient way, I thought, to approach this was to take a look at this roundup, essentially. What matters most about Trump's guilty verdict? Why should you try to think of that for yourself when the New York Times could tell you what matters most, according to 7 different opinion writers? So it's a bit of a one of those, I don't know what you would call it, tutti frutti, ice cream sundae here with 7 scoops for your reading pleasure, or at least mine anyway. And you get to listen. Here's the collection that they've put together here. Should we get just right to it? What mattered? Rather than read you the introductory paragraph, it's a bunch of people talking about it. And who are the people? You want to know before we read? Jamel Bowie, right up top here. Matthew Continetti, David French, Michelle Goldberg, Quinta Jurecic, Daniel McCarthy, and Kristen Soltis Anderson. I mean, that's a pretty good collection, right? There's even some people I've heard of in that collection. And sounds like a pretty typical roundup. I mean, it is the New York Times. Of course, it's going to, it's going to lean heavily on people who appear on their pages all the time. They've already paid for them. It's a sunk cost. You might as well ask these guys to chip in. Jamel says, I am no lawyer and did not follow every in and out of the trial. I feel about that way, although I am a lawyer, as it turns out. But okay, if there was a single thing that doomed Donald Trump, or at least if there was a single thing that harmed his effort to escape a guilty verdict, I mean, that might be all there is to it. It was his total contempt for the process and the proceedings. It's hard to imagine that he was helped in any way by his constant attacks on the judge, on the jury, on the trial itself. The jury obviously is asked only to evaluate the evidence before it. And yet it is asking a lot of anyone to sit and ignore the fact that the defendant has publicly turned you into an enemy. I would add at this point that it's difficult to ignore the fact that you're getting up and going through this ordeal and showing up in the courtroom and paying attention, and the defendant is snoozing and maybe farting, but certainly sleeping. I mean, he may have been trying to put on a show of contempt for the proceedings, but that's a contempt for you as the jury, and that had to have sunk in at some point as well. Matthew Continetti says he's got a different take on what mattered. There's 7 different things that mattered, as it turns out. What mattered was that this case was brought at all. When Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney, indicted Trump in April of 2023, he not only established the dangerous precedent that local officials can bring criminal charges against former presidents. Is that dangerous? He annexed the 2024 presidential campaign to the legal system with unknown and potentially hazardous consequences. Well, I don't know. Bragg's actions undermined confidence in the rule of law and rallied GOP voters to Trump, helping him win a 3rd consecutive Republican nomination. Bragg didn't defeat Trumpism. He revived it. Well, we have some differences there on that. David French, what does he have to say? The prosecution had a compelling story to tell. Trump did not want Stormy Daniels to go public right after the Access Hollywood tape with evidence that would demonstrate that he does, in fact, believe that his celebrity entitled him to do what he wanted with women. That's a pretty good take so far. And when Trump concealed the nature of the payments, the prosecution could easily make the case, at least to the jury, that he must have known that the payments were legally problematic. Trial outcomes are often dictated by the side that can create the most coherent narrative, and the prosecution's theory of the case was easy for the jury to grasp. That seems pretty clear and straightforward, even for David French. Continetti, I guess, just dedicated to the proposition that the whole thing is somehow illegitimate. It was an interesting theory. Well, how dare these little local prosecutors bring cases against people who commit crimes in their jurisdictions? Because some of them are from other jurisdictions or have very important jobs at different levels other than the one that the local prosecutor. Well, you commit a crime, you commit a crime. That's the jurisdiction. That's the only people who can prosecute you for it. That's the way it works. Welcome to the system. Oh, well. You knew we were going to disagree with that one. Okay, before things get too cooled off here, Michelle Goldberg. She comments, the mountain of evidence. That's what mattered here. Though the discourse around the trial was all about the wisdom of Bragg bringing charges in the first place, remember that? The question in court was more straightforward. Did Trump do what he was accused of? That's what courts do. That's what they handle. That's true. The prosecution showed that he did. Trump's defense, meanwhile, made the ludicrous argument that he never had sex with Stormy Daniels and that the $420,000 paid to Trump's former fixer, Michael Cohen, which was part of the reason he went to prison, Cohen, was a legitimate legal fee. It would have been shocking if the jury had bought it. That also a good point and a good observation. Quinta Jurecic says there's no way to know what led the jurors to reach the verdict they did. No, there's a way. I mean, we're not privy to it. But throughout the trial, I was struck by the insistence of Trump's lawyers on pursuing arguments or lines of questioning that seemed unhelpful to their case. Todd Blanche, for example, insisted repeatedly that Trump had never slept with Stormy Daniels, even though this denial boxed Trump into a weaker argument. These tactics by the defense seemed designed to placate Trump's own vanity and sense of grievance, but even if they made the client happy, it's hard to imagine that they helped his case with the jury. Good point, and he apparently did not help his case with the jury. Daniel McCarthy writes, the dizzying number of charges and the virtual absence of any dispute about the fact at the core of the case meant the prosecution only had to get the jury to doubt Trump's motives. Judge Juan Marchand's instructions were broad enough that the jury had many opportunities to find Trump guilty, and they did. And then, lastly, quickly, it looks like Kristen Soltis Anderson, who says, focusing on winning the political battle and the communications battle while facing legal trouble only gets you so far. The law doesn't necessarily care about public opinion. All right, and then another round of a different question. Will it have an impact on the 2024 election? That's the question I guess everybody is asking themselves now if they're political junkies. Jamel Bowie says, I do not know if the guilty verdict will matter significantly for the 2024 presidential election, although it's fair to say that no presidential candidate wants to be a felon. If anything, I suspect that Trump's conviction will be part of a background radiation of scandal that could weaken him beyond repair. One thing I do know, however, is that the guilty verdict is yet another instance of a fundamental truth of the Trump era. It has not been the institutions or the guardrails that have restrained the former president. It's been ordinary American citizens who, when given the opportunity, have not hesitated to hold him accountable. That's a good point, and probably a good point in the upcoming battle over how to handle it strategically on the Democratic side. Lots of fighting already about, well, should Democrats remain above the fray? Or should they get in there and attack and hang the felon tag on Trump every chance they get? Or some sort of compromise position in which Biden himself remains above the fray and surrogates and attack dogs do the work of hanging the felon tag on Trump, or, other variations of those two themes. Continetti, what does he have to say? I guess they felt like they had to include him, or else somebody somewhere wouldn't subscribe anymore. I don't know. By November, we will be talking about something else. Could be another conviction, or, of course, it could be he would be a twice convicted felon in at least 2 jurisdictions if the courts weren't dragging their feet about allowing those trials to go forward. If we know one thing about Trump, it is that he's an expert at changing the subject. More important, despite President Biden's efforts to shift the focus of the campaign to Trump's rhetoric and conduct, the 2024 election is not about the former president. It is about the incumbent's performance in office. I don't know. The electorate will decide Biden's fate based on its perceptions of the economy, the southern border, and America's global standing, which, he ignores will suffer horribly if you elect a convicted felon. A guilty verdict won't lower prices, reduce border crossings, or make the world a safer place. I don't know. I mean, I don't see why it would lower price. Well, it did. It lowered stock prices for DJT, the Trump media property. I don't know if it'll reduce border crossings, but will it make the world a safer place? I don't know. If a guy gets convicted of a criminal act and goes to jail for it, we usually say that's about making the world a safer place. So I don't know. David French says, yes, it'll have an impact. Biden's main weakness is with disconnected voters. And if there's one single news item that can break through with even the most apathetic citizens, it's the headline, Trump guilty on all counts. And those headlines are out there. MAGA will redouble its support for Trump, of course, and some disconnected voters may well believe that the prosecution was political, but Trump is now a felon and that won't matter. Oh, I'm sorry, this will matter. It won't matter that they think the prosecution was political, I guess, is what I was trying to say. Don't expect anything like a dam break in public opinion that washes Trump away, but this will erode his support, and in a close election, every bit of erosion matters. Goldberg saying, will it matter or will it have an impact? I guess a small one. A recent New York Times Siena poll of swing state voters, showed that a majority didn't expect the conviction, so some might be jarred by it. Trump loyalists will easily rationalize casting ballots for a felon. Haya Raichik, I note, already has done so. But then again, she's our Itamar Ben-Gvir, so it should be of no surprise to you. But if this election is as close as the last two, even small shifts among wavering voters could be significant. Jurasik says, Trump has a firm base of supporters who may be galvanized by his conviction, but they are not enough to win him the election on their own. His fate instead will rest with the voters whose support for him is less passionately held. People who might otherwise vote Republican but are put off by Trump's boorishness. This verdict emphasizes all the aspects of Trump that the voters might find off-putting. Trump's erratic behavior, his constant scandals. If this conviction harms Trump, it will likely be because a small but significant number of people in swing states simply couldn't bring themselves to pull the lever for a felon. I think that's probably about where we've been in our discussions of it here. McCarthy writes, by outraging Trump supporters, the verdict will strengthen him, and voters who harbor doubts about the justice system may see him as more sympathetic as a result of this. He's all the more an outsider and rebel now. Oh, this is horrible. The penalties may hamper Trump campaigning. I mean, he's got leg irons and a ball and chain on. I mean, you can't miss that symbolism. He should. Anyway, but I expect the race will remain competitive and even become more intense. And then Soltis Anderson finishing things up here saying it may only matter at the margins. And if Greg were here, he would tell you the margins is what's going to determine the outcome. Voters who strongly dislike Trump will be thrilled with the verdict, but it won't change things. They were never going to vote for him anyway. That's a throwaway answer. We didn't need to waste any time on that one. Voters who like him will not be surprised by a guilty verdict because they've generally viewed the trial as political from the start. I believe the sentencing will play a bigger role in influencing the small group of persuadable voters as Americans are forced to choose whether to vote for someone who could be facing prison time. All right. So now you've got a sampling of the writing and thinking out there, which is about, I would say, pretty much exactly what we thought we would get in taking that sampling. Let's see. There are some other voices that weren't included in this that definitely belong in the morning potpourri, and it is still the first segment. So perhaps we'll throw in a couple others before going a little bit more widely afield. Let's see. The Guardian is carrying Margaret Sullivan, who ordinarily would probably be among the sampling we would check in with. At long last, Teflon Don Trump couldn't unstick himself from the legal system. That's good news and also a good point. In a divided world that can't seem to agree on a single fact, the subheader says, we now have one that is impossible to argue with. Trump is a felon. Though they are out there arguing with it. Not really, or it was only technicality, or it's an invented crime in New York, or it was biased, or he was railroaded, or it was a kangaroo court, what have you. There are certainly arguments, and they're being made. No doubt about that. All right, a little more rapidly cooling coffee here. For decades, he skated. Margaret Sullivan begins. Nothing seemed to stick to the Teflon-coated businessman turned president. He was a little greasy. So, there was that. The guy who didn't pay his bills, who constantly lied, who mocked a disabled journalist, who insulted a Gold Star family, who bragged about grabbing women by their private parts, who praised dictators, who urged a violent mob to overturn an election, who was unperturbed as his own vice president was threatened with hanging. Yes, he skated. Through 2 impeachments, through countless investigations and accusations, and through so much chaos that responsible U.S. citizens became almost numb and hopeless. And then came Thursday afternoon, when 12 regular New Yorkers, against the odds and against the conventional wisdom, simply did their civic duty and convicted Donald Trump, unanimously, on all counts, and quickly. No hung jury, no hesitation. Their deliberations lasted not weeks, but mere hours. And no mixed decisions. It took the U.S. jury system to finally bring some accountability and quite a bit of help from an adult film actor, a sleazy tabloid executive, and the ex-president's former fixer, a notorious liar himself. In a world so divided that our political tribes can't seem to agree on a single fact, we now have one that's impossible to argue with. Trump is a convicted felon, the first U.S. president to be convicted of a crime. The crime of falsifying documents to cover up a hush money payment to Stormy Daniels prior to the 2016 election, lest she tell her tale of their tryst. That much we know. That much can't be denied, no matter how the bitter whining on Fox News, or the inevitable claims of an unfair legal system and a corrupt judge. Okay, probably mangled that sentence there somewhere. And to those millions who have watched his destructive and sordid career for years, the jury's decision in a New York courtroom brought a moment of both regrettable and righteous. Regrettable? Okay, of course, because it's all so sordid and shameful that this con man was able to operate with impunity. And righteous, because somehow the truth won out in this lower Manhattan courtroom, and because, quite simply, Trump deserves it. What we don't know is if it will matter to his bid for the presidency in November. If you believe public opinion polls, it's wise to be skeptical, by the way. She adds, it probably will make a difference, not to his most loyal followers, of course, who have been taught to believe only him. These are the followers who Trump himself famously said wouldn't change their votes if he shot someone on Fifth Avenue. But to some number of reasonable Americans, it will matter, and they will decide that they'd rather not put a convicted felon back in the White House, where he never belonged to begin with. A new Marist poll released this week estimated that 2/3 of voters said a felony conviction wouldn't change their minds, but 17% of the respondents, presumably representing millions of Americans, allowed that they would be less likely to vote for a convicted Trump. No, now we have one. The right-wing media, of course, will do what it can to save him. It's already working on the case. In the initial hour or so after the verdict, the pundit and former prosecutor Jeanine Pirro, all visibly indignant, told the Fox News faithful that, quote, "This is warfare," and then glug, 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 glug. And God help America after what I've seen in the last 2 weeks. It sounds a little bit like Rudy Giuliani there in the end. And Trump predictably blasted the trial as rigged and disgraceful, having said just on Wednesday that even the sainted Mother Teresa couldn't have survived its horrors. But two facts remain. Trump is now a convicted felon, and there is, after his endless and appalling parade of malfeasance, some semblance of justice. All right, also well worth having in our roundup, and there's more. But I gotta do a couple extra clicks to get back through it. Where to next? Oh, it's not registering my clicks for some reason. All right, here we go. Hopping back into Pocket. There are so many. Let's see. It's coming up on, well, we're getting close to the break. I got Amanda Marcotte still sitting in the inbox, Philip Bump, and Greg Sargent. Where do you want to start? Okay, why don't we start with, we'll start with Greg Sargent, because that's next, and see how much we can get through. Always worth doing, and we haven't read his stuff on the air in the last couple of days, so it's about time. First, the headline, Trump's stunning guilty verdict shatters his aura of invincibility. Remember, that's the Teflon idea. And, this too, a good point. Everybody making subtly different points here. His conviction on 34 felony counts is powerful new information, and we should hold institutional Democrats responsible if they don't use it ruthlessly and effectively. This another current among the punditry, the left-leaning punditry anyway. One of the most bizarre things about the Donald Trump era has been the persistence of his aura of invincibility. Trump, who never reads books but somehow harbors deep knowledge of what history tells us about how autocrats succeed, cultivates this aura relentlessly. The nonstop lying about his poll strength, the absolute refusal to concede the slightest error in any situation, the endlessly hallucinogenic fabrications about his crowd sizes, all of it flows from his seemingly instinctual sense that conceding any hint of weakness must be resisted at all costs, lest it unleash forces that shatter him entirely. The guilty verdict that a Manhattan jury handed to Trump in his hush money trial, he was convicted on all 34 felony counts, is surely just a powerful spectacle, just such a powerful spectacle, in part because it upends that dynamic. Only hours ago, it was possible to still see Trump as a seemingly untouchable figure on the verge of defying us all again. An entire political party had lined up behind him to cast the proceedings as illegitimate. No matter how sleazy, grotesque, and damning the revelations, his grip on the GOP seemed to only grow stronger. His poll numbers refused to budge. He was violating his gag order with impunity, almost, insulting the judge and his family, hypnotizing millions of rank-and-file Republicans into seeing him as a victim of overzealous law enforcement, and generally unfurling a big, fat middle finger, it's not that big, though, at the justice system and at the rule of law itself. He was getting away with all of it, again, until he didn't. The force of this truth should inform how Democrats proceed now. Democratic operatives sometimes say there's no sense in talking about Trump's criminal trials because his negatives are baked in, as the grading consultant speak has it. Indeed, according to a source familiar with the situation, the Biden campaign has no plans for any paid ads on the verdict. The campaign did put out a powerful statement about the verdict, and it's somewhat understandable that Biden himself is cautious about commenting on Trump's legal travails, given that his own Justice Department is prosecuting Trump. Not in this case, but in another one. But that can't set the tone for the whole party. Other Democratic groups and elected officials must do all they can to make sure that the voters know about this conviction, and more importantly, that Republican lawmakers who are running for re-election as we speak lined up like little robots to savage the justice system, all to put Trump above accountability and the law. After all, Republicans are in a terrible trap. Look what happened when Larry Hogan, who's running for Senate in deep blue Maryland, dared to say the absolute minimum of what's responsible here, that the system should be respected. He was, of course, immediately attacked by Chris Lasivita. You just ended your campaign. It's pretty amazing. We'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio, segment 2. We continue on with the roundups of the big news of the day, of course, the conviction of Donald Trump on 34 counts. Yes, up in New York, we were just in the middle of reading Greg Sargent's take on this, and getting through some of the, it's a good sampling, I think. Getting the, what was the old terminology for it? Oh, well, it doesn't matter anyway. We were talking about grassroots. They used to say grass tips, like sort of the top level of the grassroots on it, but they're not, it's not grassroots. It's elite journalists, but good ones nonetheless. Anyway, just collecting general sampling so we all know where we fit in the spectrum here, but I think we're all pretty comfortable with our feelings about the conviction. We were just reading, though, that when Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, former governor of Maryland, now running for Senate as a Republican in, as they said, deep blue Maryland, did the bare minimum of acknowledging the fact that Trump had just been convicted, duly convicted in a court of law, got word through, I guess, is this on Twitter, that from Chris Lasivita, the campaign manager for Trump, saying, you just ended your campaign. Well, we'll see. But that wouldn't be the bad thing, the worst thing that could happen up in Maryland. Okay. What that really shows, he goes on to say, is how devastating it would be for Trump if more Republicans follow suit. Chris Lasivita, Trump's campaign manager, knows perfectly well that nothing about any of this is baked in. In a way, the baked-in idea is just another version of the invincibility thesis. That's a good point, and it's nonsense. A guilty verdict is powerful new information. The fact that one of the major party nominees is a convicted felon is an unprecedented and deeply jarring situation. We should hold institutional Democrats responsible if they don't use it, and use it ruthlessly and effectively. Although the fact that they haven't exactly done so just yet, and I'm not even certain that that's even a fair blanket statement. I don't really know who's put out statements about these things. It takes a while for these things to percolate and people to find the good ones and circulate them and find out. But, yeah, could they have had a coordinated effort right away in the first few minutes after the announcement of the verdict? Yes, that's true. But I think they're hoping that it will take on the look of an organic movement to hold Trump accountable and to attack those who were supporting him, and that this groundswell build up slowly. We'll see, but certainly important. And I also saw Thomas Zimmer on Blue Sky yesterday, just talking about how important it is for leadership of some kind. Usually political leadership, but leadership of some kind, probably any kind, will do, as I was illustrating with a different fact, but saying how important it is that leadership say, yes, there is something extraordinary happening here. It is jarring. You should feel weird that this is happening. This is a momentous occasion, and it's a big deal, and we give you permission to believe it's a big deal. My point, actually, sort of in support of what he said, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be elected officials or politicians or even pundits who do it. It just, it has to be someone. My case in point was with COVID, that in the face of a global pandemic, the rest of the world was reacting slowly but seriously to. Not really sure exactly what the reaction should be, but certainly in other countries, they were taking it, they were regarding it differently and more seriously. And Trump, for political and personal reasons, was just never going to do that. And he just really, I guess he thought, I don't know, to the extent that Americans had to take it seriously, they just would, because there it is. I don't know. Other people are saying take it seriously, but he abdicated the role as president of warning people to take it seriously. And instead, we had to rely on President Basketball to tell us that the situation was serious. And I am always worried about this when I say President Basketball, that I think that people will think I'm calling Trump like president. When I refer to him as basketball, he's President Basketball face. But President Basketball, of course, is just is the NBA, which acted in the role as President of the United States in the absence of a real President of the United States at the time, who would not warn anybody and not take the job seriously in preparing for or alerting people to the dangers of the pandemic. And instead, it took the leadership of TV sports being canceled to get through to people. It would have worked if the president had gone on the air and said, this is actually quite an emergency and we really need to do something. It wouldn't have convinced everybody necessarily, but it would have done the thing it was supposed to do. But in the absence of that, we all looked around at each other. No member of Congress can declare this. A judge? Not really. I don't know. Who would get to say with authority that something serious was happening and you needed to take it seriously and do something differently in your life? And TV sports turned out to be the leader we needed at that point. Anyway, so yes, this too. There's nothing that President Basketball can do to tell people that it's serious that Donald Trump has been convicted, but it may fall to other leaders. And some of them will be international leaders as well. Like, for instance, the news yesterday, I don't know, actually haven't confirmed it. Maybe I should look around for a news source, but lots of people on social media insisting that, for instance, according to the rules, which I don't know. I haven't read the rules from up in Canada, but apparently as a convicted felon, Donald Trump would not be permitted in the first instance, and I guess without some special arrangements, to cross the border into Canada. Of course, that would mean we're not sending our best, et cetera, et cetera. You know how they want to defend the southern border to prevent criminals from crossing the border and bringing their crime to the north. So even Republicans are opposed to that. Anyway, so, I mean, they can contribute to the necessary job of alerting people that, something strange, something has changed here, and you need to acknowledge that. All right, back to what Greg Sargent was saying, that we should hold institutional Democrats responsible if they don't use it, and use it ruthlessly and effectively. True, the hush money affair is less serious than Trump's alleged crimes related to the insurrection and the theft of national security documents. But just to push back on that, I have seen some convincing writing about all of this. Just basically the idea that, look, it seems like it's less important, but the cover-up of Trump's various sexual encounters, and then, of course, the cover-up of the cover-up, and the falsifying of the documents, that helps raise it up to felony level so that you can run around saying he is a felon. But the whole idea of the cover-up of the affairs in the wake of the Access Hollywood tapes, I mean, to the extent it was successful, it changed history. And much for the worse, by the way. We're dealing with Trumpism now, and for who knows how long, even after Trump. But it was and I don't know what to say. The politics of the Trump era were considered a virtual impossibility going in, and now they're not only political reality, but we're not sure how we're going to shake it, or even if it's shakeable. But when I say it was a political impossibility, I mean, I'm thinking back to the people who said, according to the old conventional wisdom, oh my God, this criticism of John McCain and saying, I like soldiers who don't get captured, okay? It was supposed to be like the end of his political career. How can you say that and still be an American politician? It is impossible. And then you found out it is not impossible. And then you found out that very few things were impossible, like will the Supreme Court spend any time considering the question of whether or not there's absolute presidential immunity, both before you're president, after you're president, doesn't matter what you do, yada, yada, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, can you erase the emoluments clause? Can you erase the 14th Amendment? Can you get away with Trump's private business practice of just go ahead and break the law and then, let people try to clean it up later, but act first, do what you want, and let the rest of the system catch up with you. There's a political impossibility, but now it's not only political reality, it will be the political style of an entire party going forward. So, it's a little difficult. But anyway, so where were we? I don't know how much less serious it is than some of these other things. I think some of the other things that he's got to go on trial for yet, stealing national security documents, trying to overthrow the election, were all foreshadowed by this one, the instances surrounding this case, that he was able to say things that would be automatic, instant political death, and everyone knows it, are now, just maybe stuff you report from day to day, but you go on. Without this cover up, we would never have reached the point. Well, he wouldn't have been in a position to steal the national security documents, certainly, but more to the point, in a position to actually possibly get away with it. That was just unbelievable at the time. Anyway, so I just wanted to point that out. But back to Greg Sargent saying, true that the hush money affair is less serious, but it shouldn't be hard to make the case that an extremely serious offense lurks beneath the tabloid trash. Trump committed extensive fraud to deceive the American people about the tawdry affair and cheat his way into the most powerful position in the world. There we are. One he never should have been granted in the first place. The GOP presidential nominee is now a convicted criminal. As Dan Pfeiffer put it, Democrats should call Trump a convicted felon at every opportunity. He's a convicted felon. There. I did it. The larger story is also a powerful one. The system sought to hold Trump accountable despite a roar of second-guessing and in the face of incredible strains inflicted on it by Trump and his GOP enablers and media propagandists, who make up an extraordinarily powerful elite cadre. The system held. That reflects positively on our country. There is time for the Biden campaign to figure out how to tell that story as well. No question, Trump could still defy political and legal gravity in plenty of ways, though some polls suggest Trump will pay a political price for his conviction. It's anyone's guess whether voters will make good on that, and a lot rides on whether Democrats succeed in driving it all home. Beyond that, Judge Aileen Cannon seems to have delayed Trump's trial for theft of state secrets. The Supreme Court could still stall Trump's insurrection-related trial until after the election, but I suspect that has now become somewhat less likely. Now that Trump has been branded a felon, dubiously helping Trump delay justice will become harder to justify and will come at a greater political and institutional price. And that, too, an important point. And before I lose track of it, I will jump back into my email because he's probably hopping up and down if he's listening live, saying, "Man, that's what I was talking about." Jeremy Freiberger did write to me, and I didn't do anything with it at the time, but he reminded me yesterday that he was interested in hearing me and Greg debate, and I don't know how I would have done it. And I mean, really, honestly, Greg Sargent has helped me out more with this one by reminding me of the fact that it's out there. I'm not sure how to approach this debate, so we'll just crack it open with Greg Sargent offering his take on it. But Jeremy asked, he said, "The debate I'm interested in hearing is you and Greg Dworkin, not Sargent, but we can pretend I'm debating with Greg Sargent, discussing how the upcoming verdict, which is now a done deal, Trump in Trump's ongoing trial, either guilty or a hung jury, how might that influence SCOTUS's immunity case decision? Could a guilty verdict push the conservative justices to cut bait and throw Trump to the wolves in hopes that Republicans come up with a different ticket topper ASAP?" I don't know if they can do that or not, but you can engineer anything you want if you really are intent on doing it. Or could a hung jury, which also didn't happen, prompt the same justices to favor continued delay? And honestly, I didn't know how to evaluate the problem because it just seemed to me, well, I don't know. I don't know whether I was thinking, either the Supreme Court would consider itself above viewing these petty proceedings in a state court, so a state trial court. Yeah, gross. We're the Supreme Court. We don't care. We're going to do what we want to do. Plus, of course, there's that feeling of impunity among particularly the hard right justices who now have to continue to defy everything and everybody just to survive. So would they just say, institutionally, we are above viewing such inputs. We act purely on, pure matters of law. If it hasn't been briefed or argued, then we don't take it into consideration. That's not really true, but that might be something that they point to. But it's beginning to make more sense now. The idea that possibly, all right, the Supreme Court, in fully considering the picture here, may say, all right, well, we gave ourselves the chance, if Trump were somehow to wriggle free, for us to say, all right, well, if the trial courts in Manhattan won't even find him guilty of this somewhat easier to grasp, more basic offense, then the idea that a federal trial court should hold him accountable for this much larger offense conceptually is just harder and harder to justify. And maybe we should do what we can to make sure we don't go down that route. But yeah, it is possible for them to say, all right, well, now that Americans are used to the fact that everybody has to go around calling Donald Trump a convicted felon, it might not be plausible for us to try to stand in the way anymore, or it might not be such a bad thing. If we were worried, to the extent any of us were worried, maybe John Roberts, about like the collapse of civil order should Trump be convicted somewhere. And then seeing, well, that has not happened. And that's a whole other story, too, by the way. People pointing out, hey, I was promised riots when they said, oh, my gosh, if there's a conviction, there's going to be people rioting in the street. And it's early yet, but it was light out yesterday. They could have been rioting in the streets. It's just no one bothered to gather in the streets. So, A, that's not happening, and B, the court may be seeing that and saying, by the time they get around in late June to finalizing their opinion before its release, it might be clear to anyone who genuinely had that fear in the back of their mind that, no, holding the former president accountable in a criminal court is not such a destructive thing after all, and be willing to go ahead with it. So we'll see. But a good point, and I think Jeremy probably wanted us to get that on the record, and yeah, good credit where credit's due, and say, yeah, good thought, Jeremy. I wasn't sure what to do with that, but Greg Sargent has helped me process it here a little bit. Now back to what he was saying, in case somebody else's letters will be better understood by reading the rest of what Greg has to say here. There was the whole point of this article. Trump's aura of invincibility has never been earned. He was impeached more times than any other president in U.S. history, and really that only has to be 2, but there you have it. He presided over the worst string of GOP electoral losses in many decades. That's true, too. People lose sight of that one somehow. He lost re-election after only a single term, which is a rare thing, which he had won only after losing the popular vote, and convincingly at that. He has never once commanded majority support in this country. That's true, too. Never cracked 50%. He had already been losing in court, already been losing in court already. Okay, well, some editor would have taken care of that normally. He's been nailed for sexually assaulting E. Jean Carroll. His company was found to have systematically lied about its worth, even though he enjoys the priciest legal representation funded partly by donor money that he fleeced from his own party, another privilege that pretty much no other defendant has ever enjoyed ever. And, that's all true. Why the aura of invincibility? You lose all the time. And now, after Trump and his elite enablers attempted mightily to wreck the whole system to keep him beyond accountability at all costs, an effort that for a time looked like it might just succeed, a jury of ordinary Americans heroically stood up and said, no. And there I have the Bugs Bunny picture in mind. The Bugs Bunny no gif comes immediately to mind for that one. Okay, so now we got Greg Sargent on the record. There's more people to consider here. Let's see. Chronologically, I went out of order to put the New York Times collection of 7, the Gang of 7, up first. But I got 2 more. Let's see if we can't squeeze them in there, because they're good and usual sources for us. Philip Bump, reminding us correctly, no one knows how Trump's guilty verdict might affect the election. I feel like we do have to go back to that and reinforce that fact. The 2024 presidential race is close enough that even little things could make a big difference, but that's hard to predict. That's just basic fact and seems true. And this was written, I think, before. Well, no, okay. It was written afterwards. It looked like it might have been written beforehand and then updated once the guilty verdict came in, but it wasn't even published until 6:44. So 6:35, I'm sorry. Then updated at 6:44. All right. Well, anyway, okay, let's get through it. History unfolded on Thursday. Never before has a former U.S. president been convicted of a crime. But then history has unfolded lots of times over the past few years when it comes to former U.S. presidents having run-ins with the legal system. Never before had a former U.S. president been indicted on criminal charges. Never before had a former president's home been searched by federal law enforcement. Of course, never before has a former president lived in a sex dungeon. But, that's not something that the lawyers are willing to allow them to say. Never before had a president's home been searched. Never before had a president-elect settled a major fraud lawsuit until Donald Trump did so in November of 2016. That question arises, or the question that arises then, is how this verdict might affect Trump's renewed political ambitions, and the answer is unsatisfying. No one knows. There are a few reasons why no one knows. One is that Trump's supporters are perhaps uniquely unaffected by negative news, or any news, about their preferred candidate. In this case, Trump and his allies have worked assiduously to frame the criminal trial in Manhattan, the one that led to his conviction on 34 felony counts, as unfounded or politically biased. The same president who convinced the majority of his party that the 2020 election was stolen has apparently convinced a big chunk of his base that none of this is rooted in his own failings. On the other hand, there are some suggestions that his base isn't entirely indifferent to this particular outcome. On Thursday morning, Marist University released polling conducted on behalf of NPR and PBS NewsHour that asked Americans whether a guilty verdict would change their planned votes in November's presidential election. 17% of registered voters said they would be less likely to vote for Trump. So did 7% of those who identify as Trump supporters. And now, the flip side to that coin, the same poll question determined that about as many voters overall said a guilty verdict would make them more likely to back Trump. That includes a quarter of Trump supporters. And here's the chart, in case you want to look at it in summary, tutti-frutti colors here. You can see the gaps in this question. Does it mean much that many of those who say their votes would change are either partisans or Trump supporters? Are there really Republicans who weren't going to vote for Trump until he got convicted of a crime? Enough to offset Republicans who were going to vote for him but now may not? Probably not, right? Is any of this significant? No one knows. It's not as though there's a bright line between going to vote for someone and not going to vote for someone that voters march toward or away from until Election Day arrives. Many of those Trump supporters might go from being excited to vote for him to determined to vote for him. Some of those 7% might go from being excited to vote for him to, well, at least he's not President Biden. The likelihood of voting is so squishy, especially this far from before voting actually begins. We have some precedent here. Oh, good. Some precedent, really. In early October 2016, about a month before the election, the Washington Post reported that Trump had been recorded making comments about groping women during a hot mic moment while taping an appearance on Access Hollywood. It was an unexpected shock to his campaign. I think it was probably expected, coming before he was established as the central figure of Republican politics, as he is now. A week later, Fox News released polling asking whether the comments Trump made on the tape were a deal breaker for voters. Views were split, but 15% of Republicans said it was. Maybe a lot of that 15% stayed home in November. Maybe they voted for Hillary Clinton. Or maybe over the following 4 weeks, their fervent views about the incident cooled somewhat. Either way, Trump won enough votes in enough states, allegedly, to win the election after a shock that wasn't expected and which his team hadn't worked to inoculate his base against. Again, this is uncharted territory, as every person in the media has said at least once over the last 3 years. It may be that this shifts polling in the short term and that the shift holds until November. Perhaps the jury's determination of guilt is the thing that finalizes Trump's loss. We don't know. We can't know. And anyone who suggests that we can is incorrect. Yes, ultimately, no one actually knows. That's true and a good reminder. Now, let's see. One more entry, I think, into the roundup, which it seems fair to have spent the first hour on this, right? Amanda Marcotte, always worth checking in with. Trump is no outlaw. He is, but trying to portray this as somehow mavericky outlaw. Sure, their stupid button-down laws say I'm a criminal, but I'm a Jesse James style outlaw. I'm a legend in my own time here. We're going to be pro-outlaw, pro-police, but also pro-outlaw. Yeah, it doesn't work really logically, but, the MAGA mind doesn't care. But she says Trump's no outlaw, just a grubby, sad criminal. Trump wants to be Jesse James, but his felony conviction exposes him as a weak fraud, desperate to hide his real face. And he's always been desperate to hide his real face behind deflated basketball makeup. Anyway, I was asked, she says, a few times by people over Memorial Day weekend, that long, long weekend, what I thought would happen in Donald Trump's criminal trial for fraud in Manhattan. I expressed cautious optimism that he would be convicted, pointing out that the prosecution presented an overwhelming amount of evidence while the defense acted like a bunch of clowns. Usually, good predictor, I think. In this case, it worked, right? Folks reacted with surprise to this prediction. They've been burned too many times watching Trump wriggle away from consequences for a dizzying number of crimes, including his efforts to overthrow democracy. For God's sake, I would add. Thursday, however, a ray of hope opened up as Trump was found guilty on 34 state felony charges. District Attorney Alvin Bragg and lead prosecutor Joshua Steinglass had two advantages over others who have tried to hold Trump accountable. First, there are no powerful Republicans swooping in to save Trump from consequences in New York. There are no corrupt Federalist judges. There are, but they didn't draw them in this case. Like Aileen Cannon or the Supreme Court Six, finding ways to delay Trump's federal trials indefinitely. No Senate Republicans to stop Trump from being rightfully convicted after his impeachment in the House of Representatives. No wealthy donors to step in and pay his civil judgments, whether for his extensive business fraud or his sexual assault of E. Jean Carroll. Second, Trump was facing a jury of his peers. I had some faith, well, whatever, that's arguable, but I had some faith that ordinary people, when faced with inescapable evidence of Trump's criminality, would suck it up and do their civic duty. Unlike, say, all the people who swore on oath to uphold the Constitution, but decided to protect the leader of the GOP instead. There was one other main reason I felt a thrum of hope, one I feared to say out loud even to my friends outside the world of politics. It sure seemed like Trump and his people expected he'd get convicted. Maybe. As the trial progressed, Trump escalated far beyond his tired litany of claims that everything was rigged against him, though he kept that pattern up. He's been experimenting by trying to cast himself as a rakish outlaw. He wants voters to imagine his crimes are about standing up to a corrupt system. In reality, he is corruption embodied, a man who has never acted on anything but self-interest and who only evades justice by paying people off, usually in promised, if infrequently actualized, political favors. Trump leans into an outlaw image as his criminal trial concludes, read a New York Times headline on Tuesday. In it, reporters Maggie Haberman and Jonah Bromwich outlined how Trump was laying the groundwork pre-verdict to spin a guilty verdict into what he hopes is an electoral asset. Let's examine that and what else she has to say after this short break. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue. It's a big story. It's going to take us a long time to get through the coverage of it, and maybe I don't know, even when we shift gears, we'll probably stay focused on Trump to some extent. There has to be more. Where were we with Amanda Marcotte? We were just reminding everyone that pre-verdict, it sounded like Trump was doing his best, or Team Trump, doing his best to prepare everyone for the possibility of a guilty verdict by pretending that would make him some sort of outlaw Jesse James type figure. And we'll see whether that works. Let's see. Maggie Haberman and Jonah Bromwich reporting on Tuesday that he was trying to see if there was any way to spin a guilty verdict as an electoral asset. He's surrounding himself with accused criminals and convicts, they reported. That doesn't seem like a good idea. Even bringing a notorious Hells Angel gangster, Chuck Zito, to the trial with him. Although I don't know whether that was so much strategic as he's a very tough guy. He's tough. He's rides a motorcycle. Very tough guy. And so am I. But that may have been all the strategizing involved in it. Anyway, they note that Trump now valorizes those prosecuted for storming the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. That's true. And that he has sold merchandise featuring his mugshot after his Georgia arrest for his coup efforts in that state. Trump's tendency to celebrate his own criminality is so extensive that Haberman and Bromwich overlook some important examples, like how Trump repeatedly compares himself to murderous gangster Al Capone, or waxes poetic about how much he adores fictional serial killer Hannibal Lecter. That's true. No doubt there's a long history of Americans romanticizing criminals, going back at least to Jesse James or Billy the Kid, who became icons in the Wild West. In the early 20th century, bank robbers like Bonnie and Clyde often became folk heroes, while mafia movies like Goodfellas or Scarface usually conclude with the downfall of their criminal anti-heroes. All too often, fans focus only on the early parts of the movies when the bad guys are riding high, before the law and their own demons catch up with them. Most recently, we witnessed how all too many people thought Walter White was the hero of Breaking Bad, instead of a character study condemning the darkness that lurks inside many otherwise upstanding citizens. But even by those standards, there's good reason to hope Trump's attempt to cast himself as a charming rogue will fall flat. For one thing, his images from the court are of a tired, elderly man with bad hair and makeup. This is not Warren Beatty sexily robbing a bank as Clyde Barrow, or a 2003-era Johnny Depp winking at the camera as Pirate Jack Sparrow. Oh, Barrow and Sparrow rhymes. But more importantly, Trump's crimes aren't a daring good time. They're just the pathetic scramblings of a loser trying to avoid being exposed as the fraud he is. The details of the crimes that led to his 34 felony convictions are not flattering. First, there was the sex itself that led to the tawdry cover-up attempt. The story told by adult film actress Stormy Daniels was not of being seduced by an irresistible bad boy. Instead, she describes a charmless bore who extracted sex by being bigger and blocking the way and making false promises that he could get her on TV. Then there was the cover-up itself. The main theme of the testimony was Donald the Coward, who hides behind a series of fixers so he never has to deal directly with the fallout from his poor choices. The stereotypically romantic outlaw is a man who dives headlong into danger. Such criminal heroes take on dopey authority figures that are fun for audiences to root against, whether it's sanctimonious cops, rich bankers, or fancy nobles whose wealth needs a little forcible redistribution. Trump, with his lickspittle staff and his checkbook crimes, is closer to corrupt Prince John than Robin Hood. His crimes aren't exactly striking against the man. He is the man, preying on vulnerable people like the 27-year-old Daniels, or the financially desperate people he defrauded through Trump University, or even some of the lost souls he snookered into storming the Capitol on January 6th. The regular folks on the New York streets weren't cheering Trump, but the brave jurors who stood against him. It felt like the end of Ghostbusters when the New Yorkers applauded our little guy heroes who saved the city from a demonic apocalypse. After being found guilty on all 34 counts, Trump did what he does best, which is whine at length to the cameras. Not very dashing. It was the same tirade we're used to hearing from him ad nauseum. He's perfect and never does anything wrong. It's everyone else who's the real criminal. And as usual, he went heavily into the racist lies while trying to invoke who the real criminals are. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, which is now where he belongs, now that he's a convicted felon and was always crazy. Terrorists, and they're taking over our country. Every word was untrue, from the numbers, which fall far short of millions by a couple of zeros, to his characterization of refugees who are families trying to escape criminal gangs, not members of them. What is especially typical of this rant, though, wasn't just the racism, but Trump's famous psychological projection. His description of immigrants would be better applied to himself. Mentally unwell terrorists who are taking over our country. Migrants are not people who sent a violent mob to the Capitol to overthrow an election and install a dictatorship. Trump did that. And there's nothing glamorous or fun about Trump or his crimes. They're just the shabby dealings of an overprivileged fat cat trying to hang on to power he never deserved in the first place. All right, there you go. Now you got Amanda Marcotte on the record, and I think we've certainly exhausted what I collected on this front, but I think we got an appropriate number of slightly different takes, and everybody's got one. There's probably more, and we'll probably hear about them more on Monday. But there you go. It was worth spending the time on it. What can I tell you? The guy got convicted in criminal court yesterday. You have to take a look at that. Okay, so some other items perhaps worth addressing or doubling back on. One, I would say, I don't know, this one's a small item that I noticed on the way to the microphone today. Oh, dear. So something's going on with Blue Sky Deck. And it is from time to time hanging up and freezing in refreshing itself in ways that make it impossible to bring you, well, some of the stories that are parked there. But I can tell you, at least in general, what was going on. I happened to see somebody circulating something about the air freshener Pine Sol flag and the how broad its intentional use is among the Christian dominionists, etc., and, spreading outward from the New Apostolic Reformation people. But in case you needed any more reason to believe that there was something particularly dumb happening around it, here is news that Breitbart reports that Dutch Sheets, you remember him, Dutch and Cece, is that his wife? C-E-C-I, Cece, I don't know how she pronounces that, Sheets. A picture of them presenting such a flag to none other than the original dummy, Sarah Palin. So she's not relevant anymore, but in case you were wondering how widely they were distributing this thing in an effort to try to drum up a movement attached to it, there's your answer. They're even going back to Sarah Palin about it and making sure that she had a piece of the, had a piece of the cloth available to her to join the movement and to try to rope her remaining supporters in. They'll take them wherever they can get them. Anyway, it just made me think that this, the flag, there's nothing inherently weird or wrong about the flag itself, as I said, until you found out about its association, even as forced as it was with these nut jobs, was an innocuous one and just a historical curiosity. But it's become, I think the easiest way for me to understand it, and we'll see whether any of you agree, it's become something like the white power hand signal thing that was briefly popular among Trump's Pepe the Frog, Groyper types, where you could flash that sign and wink at people about it, and then if people said, look, they're making the white power sign, this is outrageous, you cannot accept them in polite society, they would say, what, it's just an okay sign, everybody knows the okay sign, I mean, come on, I'm not doing anything wrong, there wasn't nothing inherently obvious, not like a Nazi salute, which, look, if you're caught doing that, you got to explain yourself. This, they were just saying, I'm just saying, okay, it's just like a thumbs up to the camera is all, wink, wink. Well, that's what the appeal to heaven flag has become. There's what? It's a pine tree. It's not like it's got a swastika on it. Yeah, but, you're giving this winking acknowledgement to one another about what it means. It's a signal among you, and we've seen it now. We found out we can't miss it anymore. It's become a Wilhelm scream. And I guess that's the way, for me anyway, that's the way to understand these things, and we'll see whether it's of any help to the rest of you as well. Okay, other stories that I wanted to turn to, some of which we began on yesterday, and some of which we might just want to revive or read back into the record. Let's see, yesterday we were beginning on, and we turned around from the emerging portrait of Judge Aileen Cannon, as reported by Alan Feuer in the New York Times the other day. I guess we'll spend some time on that, it being Friday. This is, of course, the one that was headlined, the emerging portrait from the judge in the documents case. Prepared, maybe, prickly and slow. This was Aileen Cannon's handling of court hearings, offers insights into how the case accusing Donald Trump of illegally retaining classified materials has become bogged down, you know how, in unresolved issues. Just let's fill in the picture here. so that we know exactly what we're talking about. To the extent that the New York Times can tell us exactly what we're talking about. A few months ago, a top prosecutor on former President Donald J. Trump's classified documents case stood up in court and told Judge Aileen M. Cannon that he was concerned about the pace of the proceeding, gingerly expressing his desire to keep the matter moving along. Almost instantly, Judge Cannon got defensive. "I can assure you that in the background there's a great deal of judicial work going on," she snapped. So, while it may not appear on the surface that anything is happening, there's a ton of work being done. In some sense, Judge Cannon had a point. Much of what judges do unfolds out of sight in the sanctity of their chambers, but at 7 public hearings over more than 10 months, Judge Cannon has left an increasingly detailed record of her decision-making skills and judicial temperament. The portrait that has emerged so far is that of an industrious but inexperienced and often insecure judge whose reluctance to rule decisively on even minor matters has permitted one of the country's most important criminal cases to become bogged down in a logjam of unresolved issues. She rarely issues rulings that explain her thinking in a way that might reveal her legal influences or guiding philosophy. And that has made her hearings, in which have taken place in a federal district court in Fort Pierce, Florida, kind of a backwater, all the more important in addressing her management of the case. Regardless of her motives, Judge Cannon has effectively imperiled the future of a criminal prosecution that once seemed the most straightforward of the 4 Mr. Trump is facing. She has largely accomplished this by granting a serious hearing to almost every issue, no matter how far-fetched, that Mr. Trump's lawyers have raised, playing directly into the former president's strategy of delaying the case from reaching trial. It appears increasingly likely that the documents case will not go to a jury before Election Day, and that the only trial that Mr. Trump will face this year will be the one now ending in Manhattan, which did end yesterday, where jurors are expected to begin deliberating on Wednesday and then convict him on Thursday over whether he falsified business records. You know what that's all about, and he is guilty, guilty, guilty. Still, the next few weeks will bring Judge Cannon's handling of the case in Florida into even sharper focus. She may soon rule on a request by Jack Smith, the special counsel overseeing the 2 federal prosecutions, to bar Mr. Trump from making public statements that could endanger federal agents working on the documents case. That move, which the judge denied this week on procedural grounds, came in response to the former president's baseless assertions that the FBI was authorized to use deadly force against him during the search 2 years ago of Mar-a-Lago's sex dungeon. After a hearing in June, Judge Cannon will also have to make a significant decision on whether to give Mr. Trump's lawyers access to communications between Smith's team and top national security officials. The lawyers made that request hoping to bolster their contention that the so-called deep state colluded with the Biden administration to bring the charges. A former federal prosecutor, Judge Cannon graduated from Duke University and the University of Michigan's law school, where she joined the Conservative Federalist Society. She was nominated to the federal bench by Trump during his final months in office and was confirmed by the Senate just days later after he was declared the loser of the 2020 election. She was already under scrutiny when she got the classified documents case last June because of a decision she made well before the indictment was filed. That ruling, which shut down the investigation into Trump until an independent arbiter sorted through reams of material seized from Mar-a-Lago, was so legally dubious that the appeals court sitting over her reversed it in unusually scathing terms. Since then, Judge Cannon has shown little of her human side in court, taking a businesslike approach to the proceedings, which always begin the same way. Invariably entering her courtroom on time. Oh boy, oh no, look out for that. She first admonishes those in the gallery not to use any electronic devices and reminds them of her rule forbidding getting up while a hearing is in progress. She then lays out the issues at hand and recounts the documents she has received that will inform the conversation. Even though she has been on the bench for only 4 years and has limited experience handling criminal cases, it's often clear that Judge Cannon has done her homework. In mid-March, for instance, she once did it, apparently. She was discussing the key elements of the Espionage Act with Emil Bove, one of Trump's lawyers, and an expert on classified information cases. At one point, she pushed back on Mr. Bove's contention that a section of the act requiring national defense information to be present in any documents charged in an indictment was so vaguely written that it was essentially unenforceable. There has been a fair amount of litigation, I think, on the defense information prong, Judge Cannon said. So it would be hard to say, based on the current state of decisional authority, that that prong in and of itself is unconstitutionally vague. Even though it meant that he had lost the point, Mr. Bove had to agree. I can't fight with the way Your Honor has phrased that, he said. That exchange, however, was a far cry from one that occurred last week when Judge Cannon was debating with Jay Bratt, one of the prosecutors, about a common theory of legal liability called the Pinkerton Rule. The rule holds that all members of a conspiracy can be held accountable for any crimes committed by their co-conspirators. Mr. Bratt said the rule would likely apply to Mr. Trump's dealings with his two co-defendants, Walter Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira, employees of Pervalago, who have been accused of conspiring with the former president to obstruct the government's repeated efforts to retrieve those classified materials. Judge Cannon seemed a bit perplexed and asked Mr. Bratt what authority he intended to rely on in applying the Pinkerton Rule. Mr. Bratt almost seemed sheepish in having to lay things out for her so simply. So the authority is Pinkerton, he said, and launched into a quick explanation. Like, where do you get this Pinkerton Rule? What authority, by what authority do you rely on applying Pinkerton Rule? Well, the Pinkerton case, Your Honor. That's why they call it the Pinkerton Rule. There's a case behind it. One of Judge Cannon's most enduring habits is her tendency to ask the same question several times, and it's never quite clear if she doesn't understand the answer she's receiving, or is she trying to push back against them. At last week's hearing, she did this to Stanley Woodward, Jr., by the way, Mr. Nauta's lawyer, as she considered his request to order prosecutors to provide him with internal communications that could help support his claims that the case against his client has been brought vindictively. I doubt there's going to be much information about that, but okay. The communications Mr. Woodward was looking for concerned a meeting that he attended at the Justice Department nearly 2 years ago, where he claims Mr. Bratt threatened to derail a judgeship he had applied for if he did not prevail on Mr. Nauta to cooperate against Mr. Trump. When Judge Cannon asked Mr. Woodward what he actually wanted from the government, his answer seemed simple enough. Any messages exchanged by prosecutors that mentioned his name. The judge then asked the second time, telling Mr. Woodward to give it to her slowly. Not sure why. But even after that, it seemed like she was still a bit confused. All right, she said, this time referring to notes she had taken. So I understand your request. It's, quote, all documents, communications concerning Mr. Woodward. Yeah. Something similar happened moments later when Judge Cannon turned to David Harbach, one of the prosecutors, to discuss Mr. Woodward's request. Mr. Harbach had just spent the better part of 5 minutes telling the judge that Mr. Woodward's claims of misconduct were a fantasy and that under the law he was not entitled to rummage around in the government's private messages. But Judge Cannon seemed to miss his point, asking Mr. Harbach if he was suggesting that prosecutors did not have any of the messages that Mr. Woodward wanted. No, he told her, explaining that Mr. Woodward had failed to present any evidence that would even merit turning over what he wanted. So I guess what you're saying is you're not sure, she asked. No, Mr. Harbach said for a third time, once more trying to explain that Mr. Woodward's description of the meeting in August of 2022 was entirely false and that the normal legal threshold for handing over private communications had simply not been reached. I know you disagree with the factual recitation from the August meeting, Judge Cannon said, but would that provide a basis for the discovery request? Well, now, clearly frustrated, Mr. Harbach said as plainly as he could that Mr. Woodward's request had no basis in either fact or law. Like, what else are you going to base it on, right? This is what I'm trying to tell you, he all but shouted at the judge. Got to be careful. That discussion ultimately ended with Judge Cannon telling Mr. Harbach that he needed to calm down. It was emblematic of the dwindling reserves of patience between Judge Cannon and the prosecutors, and with good reason, I guess. She's just not very good at this. In October, for example, Judge Cannon lashed out at what Mr. Harbach at a different hearing about whether Mr. Woodward had a conflict of interest in the case. The question revolved around the fact that Mr. Woodward was representing Mr. Nauta, one of the defendants, and had formerly represented a man likely to testify for the government at trial. When Mr. Harbach expressed concern that Mr. Woodward might have to cross-examine a former client, a situation that could easily lead to a conflict, Judge Cannon chided him for having failed to mention that possibility in his written filings submitted before the hearing. Citing Mr. Harbach's last-minute introduction of an issue that was not briefed, she abruptly ended the hearing and assailed the prosecution for wasting the court's time. But she acted very differently at a hearing last week when Mr. Woodward made several arguments about his claims of vindictive prosecution that had never appeared in any of his filings. Judge Cannon hardly seemed to notice that he had wandered from his script, let alone rebuke him. That is an interesting observation. There is one subject the defense loves to talk about that always seems to set Judge Cannon on edge: Mr. Trump's presidential campaign. When she has allowed his lawyers leeway in using their briefings to make political arguments, or while she has allowed, she has repeatedly shut them down when they have tried to raise the subject of politics in court. In early March, Mr. Bove began an argument on a highly technical legal issue by complaining that Mr. Trump should not have been in court at all that day, but insisted should have been out campaigning. Apparently annoyed, Judge Cannon cut him off. Okay. Can we talk about the actual legal issues? That's actually it for that's a weird way of ending the article, but I guess that's supposed to be the both sides thing. Well, at one point she grew frustrated with the defense as well, although, not by much, if you ask me. The more interesting revelation there was, she's only concerned about things not being briefed ahead of time when it's an apparently new issue being raised by the prosecution. But I mean, I don't know. If you discover it later on after the briefings are written, why can't you bring that up? It didn't bother her at all when the defense brought up new information and new arguments that were not in the previously written pleadings. Okay. But we get some idea of how she's operating and how difficult it can sometimes be to get her to understand really super basic things. Like, what's your authority for citing that case? The case? Yeah, I mean, what do you mean? What's my authority for citing authority? Judges always want you to cite authority. That's how law works. I mean, what am I supposed to tell you about that? How can I explain that one to you without being condescending? So maybe you just have to be condescending is all there is to it. Okay, let's see. Back to the flag issue, which isn't really much of an issue. We all kind of understand what that's about inherently. I did mention yesterday that I saw some people, and this isn't one of the people that I actually saw doing it, but this is so close to the idea that I thought I would bring it back up here. Washington Post's a column here from Monica Hess. Is it Hess or Hesse? Does she give an extra syllable to that? Pointing out the similar sentiments to some of the reaction that we noted yesterday to Sam Alito's rejection of calls for his recusal in the tongue-in-cheek piece titled, "It's a Woman's Right to Fly Her Own Flag. Hear, hear, Justice Alito." With a little bit of irony wrapped up in all this, the Supreme Court justice is defending a woman's freedom, his wife's, of course, to make her own decisions without the influence of a man. Say more. Tell us more about that, Justice Alito. On Wednesday, Supreme Court Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr. sent a letter to Senators Dick Durbin and Sheldon Whitehouse. I think I had mistakenly identified Chuck Schumer as the co-writer of that letter a couple of days ago. It was Durbin and Whitehouse, explaining the provenance of two questionable flags that had flown over Alito's residences. Both flags, one, of course, the upside-down American flag, and one, the Pine Sol air freshener flag, have been used by Donald Trump supporting election deniers. But in this letter, Alito explained that the flags have nothing to do with him. They were flown by his wife. His wife's flags, he repeatedly insisted, were his wife's business and his wife's business alone. It's a great letter. Let's take a closer look. My wife and I own our Virginia home jointly, wrote the conservative 74-year-old George W. Bush appointee. She therefore has the legal right to use the property as she sees fit, and there were no additional steps that I could have taken to have the flag taken down more promptly. As for the other flag flown at their New Jersey beach house, that home was purchased with his wife's money and is titled in her name. So there you go. There was nothing he could do about it. He's powerless in the face of the law. Yes, excellent. I am with you so far, Justice Alito. I applaud your recognition of a woman's right, well, to oversee her own flags on her own property without the influence or governance of a man. My wife's reasons for flying the flag are not relevant for present purposes, he wrote. I'm glad you made this point, Justice Alito. Sometimes women have deeply personal reasons for needing to fly a flag, and those reasons are not our or the government's business. My wife is a private citizen. Absolutely, she is a private citizen. Here and now, I stand with Justice Samuel Alito in being horrified that lawmakers would presume to involve themselves in decisions that should be made between a woman and her flag maker. Yes, okay, finally, some rights for women in this place.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, here we go. There's the button. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We got one more segment to prepare you for the weekend, and I was reading. Who was I reading here? Monica Hess. Yes, sorry, Monica. But reading her very interesting and tongue-in-cheek reaction to Alito's rejection of the calls for his recusal. And reiterating, hey, what could I do? My wife, she wanted to fly this flag. And there was nothing I could do about it because, after all, I only had equal rights in the property. All right. Well, anyway, very interesting. And, of course, then the appeal to her privacy as a private citizen. And who are we to insist that the government come in between a woman and her flag maker, as she puts it here. My wife is fond of flying flags. I am not, he said in his letter, and this is where Justice Alito really outdoes himself. He is showing a truly evolved understanding of flag displaying issues. He acknowledges that he personally would not fly a flag, and that's fine. Not flying a flag is entirely his business. But Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito recognizes that his personal preferences regarding flags should have no bearing on whether millions of women around the country choose to fly flags. My wife is an independently minded private citizen. She makes her own decisions, and I honor her right to do so. I will grant you, Alito is getting a little repetitive. He has already made these points elsewhere in his letter, but I would argue that his repetition serves moral and rhetorical purposes. In this sentence, Alito is affirming that Mrs. Alito is legally permitted to fly flags, not only because she is an owner of the property on which the flags were flown, but also because she is an independent being who is capable of making her own decisions. And even when Alito thinks his wife is making bad decisions, he is showing that he still recognizes that those decisions are hers to make. You get it? Even when he feels as if those decisions personally affect him because his religion is opposed to flags, perhaps, or because his friends all hate flags. and his social and political lives will be made uncomfortable if people find out he's flying them, he still understands that it is ultimately not his call whether to fly a flag. If he were opposed to flag flying, maybe he should have been more careful about providing the pole. Oh, man. Alito concludes with asking that his wife be left alone to enjoy her vacation home and her flag. It's a place away from Washington where she should be able to relax. Oh, hold on a second here. Once again, we're running into this problem of only part of the article being displayed here. I wonder whether we'd be better off reading it in pocket, or even if that's possible. Yeah, that's kind of a weird one. Let's see. Why does it cut off in the middle of this thing, and where can I read it? No, I guess it's done the same thing. Well, let's see if it loads the whole thing here. There we are. Bravo, Justice Alito. I am buoyed and heartened by your thoughtful, spirited defense of your wife. You and I have not always seen eye to eye, but I am glad that we have at last found some common ground on issues related to women's privacy, autonomy, independence, and decision-making capabilities vis-a-vis government interference. I look forward to reading many more of your thoughts regarding women's rights to obtain flags. And by flags, of course, I mean abortions. Thank you, and good night. Yeah, well put. Well, one and only one woman in America has rights. And as it turns out, it's Mrs. Alito. Once again, finding sympathy with these causes when things happen to them. All right. So a little bit less than the full segment here to turn our attention to other things that you might be interested in knowing before the weekend comes. Which one will it be? Gosh, there's a couple of different directions that we could go. And let's see. Well, I'll at least mention briefly that there's some information out there. This item I got is literally just, well, this happened. No news analysis behind it, but I should at least alert you to the fact that Reuters reported yesterday that Benny Gantz, who is a member of the Israeli War Cabinet and leader of one of the other more centrist parties that are outside of normally the governing coalition, but have been included in the war council here. Benny Gantz has called for the dissolution of the current Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and to call for elections sooner than they were otherwise expected, which could have the effect of finally undermining and dislodging possibly the Netanyahu government. But I'm not certain that we know or have a really good, clear picture of what the outcome of the elections are likely to be. But it's important that happened. And there's a little bit more information now provided than just that. And a new headline slapped on the piece, too, written by Ari Rabinovich, again at Reuters. Israeli centrist party increases pressure on Netanyahu government is now the headline. I don't know whether that means that they've backed off from the call for elections or there's just a different focus here. But Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz's centrist party proposed on Thursday a bill to dissolve parliament, showing the growing strains in Netanyahu's government, even if the prime minister has enough lawmakers to keep him in office. The move follows an ultimatum Gantz issued in May, demanding that Netanyahu agree to a day-after plan for the Gaza war by June 8th. He threatened to quit the coalition if no such agreement was forthcoming, although the Prime Minister's Likud party and hard-right allies still have a majority of seats even without Gantz. Netanyahu, who has long pegged his reputation on being a security hawk, has faced rising public discontent after the October 7th Hamas attack that happened on his watch. The Israeli offensive on Gaza since then has prompted international criticism, to say the least, including from Israel's most important ally, the United States. Gantz joined the Netanyahu government shortly after the October 7th attack. As a member of the War Cabinet, he has helped, everything's jumped around here. He has helped manage the Israeli offensive in Gaza, but strains have grown as the war dragged on. There's much more, not that much more. It's actually a pretty limited piece, but just wanted to let you know that movement had happened. And also maybe something you might find of some interest over the weekend. The Guardian's writing about, the title of the piece, Solidarity Over Hatred. This focus of this piece, though, the small band of Israelis stopping settlers obstructing aid trucks. You've no doubt heard about the West Bank settlers who have made it their business to try and get in the way of and otherwise obstruct the provision of aid to Gaza, and wondered perhaps where is the pushback on that. And I guess it's here in this particular article. Might be heartening to some extent for you to read about it. The piece by Lorenzo Tondo and Kike Kirsenbaum is my best guess at the pronunciations, the names involved here. Peace activists confronting settlers acknowledge they are a minority within a minority. But important for people to know, particularly as there are sweeping pronouncements rather. The sweeping pronunciations are my problem. The sweeping pronouncements of protesters' views of Israelis in general. Some people claim that it is their view of Jews in general, which for some people is no doubt true, but we hope for most not true. But I think also important to keep in mind in this, while this will be welcomed by some of the Palestinian supporting protesters, others of them will find themselves compelled to reject this help because it is, of course, coming from people who properly consider themselves Zionists. I just thought I would point that out. There was some other very interesting internal criticism being published overseas here, but internal Israeli criticism of the conduct of the war in Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. But, and while it was often being welcomed by, or pointed to at least by pro-Palestinian folks and saying, even so-and-so, an Israeli says that, this, that, or the other thing in support of their point. But if they are in the same breath or, even closely adjacent breath saying, and we reject all of this because after all, you are Zionists, then you need to remember that some of this support that you're pointing to also comes from Zionists, which will only bring us back to the discussion of what the hell is a Zionist? And the answer is it could be anything. But you point to the most extreme Zionists and say that is Zionism. I remind you that even the people who are the Israelis here who are joining and taking on in many cases, armed and crazy West Bank settlers in an effort to make sure that this aid gets through, will still tell you, yes, at the end of the day, I want these trucks to go through and I would like Israel to exist as a nation. And as a majority Jewish nation at that, they are Zionists, whether they believe in a two-state solution. If they do, there's a second state involved in that, and it's a Zionist one. Unless you are supporting a one-state solution in which the state is run by and dominated by Arab citizens of the area, frequently, FKA Palestinians, then you're a Zionist. There are plenty of people who would agree with that outcome. They're not Zionists. But if you are universally rejecting the word of Zionists and trying to keep them from the conversations, then no relying on them when they support your position either. You should probably come to a better conclusion. All right. I didn't really want to read that article, although it's an interesting and nuanced one, and you ought to read it, and it's good information. I want you to be aware of it for the weekend. In terms of other things I want you to be aware of for the weekend that you might not give over time to reading, and depart slightly from what we've spent the previous hour and a half on. Two profiles emerged probably before last week. One from NBC News, one from the New York Times, but both focusing on a sideshow in all of this, and a sideshow to the sideshow at that. RFK Jr. is the sideshow. The sideshow to his sideshow is his vice presidential candidate. But the New York Times profile, at least, I did see a piece of it. I don't know whether NBC News echoes a lot of it, but it is Brandy Zadrozny. And so probably worth looking at all on its own. But the New York Times was the first one out, and the one with, as far as I'm aware, the one that contained the weirder and more shocking revelations, which I am sure would make it into Brandy Zadrozny's profile as well. But I didn't get a chance to skim hers yet. You can do that over the weekend, and you can do so with this in mind. From the New York Times, the profile of Nicole Shanahan by Kirsten Grind, is that right? Or Grind? Is it? You tell me. Grind is an interesting and ironic version of the pronunciation. And here we are having the printout hang up again. I have no idea exactly what's going on. That's doing this, but it's making it impossible to read and impossible to deal with on the air. So I'll try and call it up on another screen. I think it may have to do with the way this particular laptop is working. So hopefully we can get that fixed. Let's go back to Pocket on the other computer and try and open this thing up. This is a waste of time. Precious minutes ticking away here. And Apple, you're failing me here. All right. And it doesn't seem, I can't even just reload the page. That's not doing the trick. All right. Here we go. Over to the other computer. Yeah. The headline on this thing has changed as well. I will point that out. Oh, right. I forgot. One of the problems is that the other computer thinks I'm not a subscriber to the New York Times, which is troubling. It may end up driving us back to Brandy Zadrozny's coverage of this anyway. But the old headline on the thing, the new anodyne headline on it is A Running Mate's History, $1 billion. Oh, all right. This has gone back and forth, I guess, depending on, I don't know, for some reason, different screens displaying different things. So they're back to the old inflammatory headline, apparently. A Running Mate's History, $1 billion, cocaine, and a fling with Elon Musk. That's an odd background, really, for anybody running for national office, don't you think? Well, it's all laid out here, finally, in the Pocket version of things. When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was considering potential running mates for his presidential run, his short list was initially topped by two well-known men with unusual resumes. I mean, both of these would have made odd and somewhat ridiculous picks. One, Aaron Rodgers, the NFL quarterback and frequent purveyor of conspiracy theories. That's how he got on the list. The other, Jesse Ventura, former governor of Minnesota a million years ago and professional wrestler known as The Body. Instead, Mr. Kennedy made a surprise pick. A woman, that's helpful, and a little-known figure, that's not so helpful, with an unusual background. It's Nicole Shanahan. Ms. Shanahan, 38, so barely, qualified age-wise for the presidency in her own right, a one-time Silicon Valley lawyer, has never held public office and has scant name recognition, but she was selected after Mr. Rogers, that's an unintended joke there, and Mr. Ventura fell through as vice presidential candidates, and Mr. Kennedy's campaign needed money to help fund its efforts to get onto state ballots. 3 people familiar with the event said, and money was something that Ms. Shanahan could provide in abundance. All right, looks like my other screen might be up and working, which is fine and helpful, so that we can run the music at the appropriate time. Ms. Shanahan has a fortune of more than $1 billion that stems largely from her divorce settlement last year with Sergey Brin, a founder of Google, whose net worth exceeds $145 billion. 3 people with knowledge of her finances said. During their 5-year marriage, a whole 5 years, Ms. Shanahan partied with Silicon Valley's elite and used recreational drugs, including cocaine, ketamine, and psychedelic mushrooms, according to 8 people and documents reviewed by the New York Times. But, it was in her irresponsible youth. She's 38 now, you see. Anyway, look, people grow up, but this is important to know. Ms. Shanahan and Mr. Brin separated after she had a sexual encounter, it wasn't they, with Elon Musk in 2021, 3 of the people said. Are the same 3 people over and over, or is it different? A rotating collection of 3, a 3-judge panel of the Court of Appeals here. The incidents were part of a rarefied and sometimes turbulent life that Ms. Shanahan led in the nation's tech capital before her turn to politics, according to interviews with more than 20 people who knew her or were briefed on her actions. Is that really worth talking to them? As well as property records, court documents, tax records, emails, and other messages reviewed by the Times. Many of the details of her life, including those of her divorce settlement, have not been reported. That's because no one knew or cared who she was up until now. Status is very important to Nicole, and the amount of money you have. Said Daniel Morris, a photographer based in Puerto Rico, who was friends with Ms. Shanahan and her first husband. She's had a couple, I guess. Jeremy Kranz, a technology investor. She's into the technology guys. On the campaign trail, Ms. Shanahan has depicted herself as a hardworking former entrepreneur and lawyer, a success story who once needed food stamps, and a unifier who can help heal a divided America. But she has omitted and embellished parts of her history, including aspects of her relationship with Mr. Brin, to make herself appear more relatable, according to people who know her and documents reviewed by the Times. In a February interview with the Times, Ms. Shanahan described herself as a one-time Silicon Valley princess. In response to questions for this article, she texted, "I'm shocked the New York Times is letting you run something like this." Really? The Kennedy campaign didn't respond to requests for comment. Shanahan has publicly denied having an affair with Mr. Musk, and Mr. Musk, a lawyer and spokesman for Mr. Brin, did not return requests for comment. Kennedy, who's running as an independent, picked Ms. Shanahan without his advisors having looked fully into her history. Whoops. Or where her money was coming from. Also, whoops. This from 2 people familiar with the campaign. But then, or by then, she had already become a crucial financier of his run. And therefore, boom, bought herself the vice presidency's nomination. Anyway, nomination as an independent, which is to say no one nominated her to anything. She's just there. Ms. Shanahan, who has said she is a vaccine skeptic like Mr. Kennedy, funded a Super Bowl ad for Mr. Kennedy this year through a $4 million donation to a super PAC, American Values 2024. In March, she infused Mr. Kennedy's campaign with an additional $2 million. And last week, she said she had given an additional $8 million. Their ticket, if it is one, has secured a place on the presidential ballot in Michigan, a swing state, as well as 5 other states. Mr. Kennedy has enough signatures to reach the ballot in 7 additional states, his campaign has said, potentially putting him and Ms. Shanahan in a position to tip the November election, if anybody actually, votes for them. Ms. Shanahan is, quote, exactly the right person. Oh, well. Mr. Kennedy said when he announced her as his running mate in March, he called her a fierce warrior mom who overcame every daunting obstacle, with cocaine and ketamine, I guess, and went on to achieve the highest levels of the American dream. It was certainly high. We know that much. A yoga festival is the next section. Let's find out about that. On the campaign trail, Ms. Shanahan, who grew up in Oakland, California, has said she knew what it was like to be one misfortune away from disaster. Not that it has helped her sympathize with people or get them vaccinated when they were one vaccine away from disaster. But anyway, her father, Sean Shanahan, couldn't hold down a job, was diagnosed with bipolar schizophrenia when she was 9 years old, and died in 2014, she has said. Her family struggled, Ms. Shanahan has said, needing food stamps and government assistance, which she can no longer get if she becomes vice president, I guess. Ms. Shanahan obtained an athletic scholarship to attend St. Mary's College High School, get that right, a private Catholic school in Berkeley, California, according to the Kennedy campaign website. So she got an athletic scholarship, yes? The school, which charges about $24,000 a year for tuition, confirmed that Ms. Shanahan had been a student, but said it had never offered scholarships. Gonna want to straighten that one out. Ms. Shanahan received some tuition assistance, the school said, but it declined to say how much. Okay, so what? They have scholarships, but they don't call them scholarships? She did get one. She didn't get one. I don't know. Ms. Shanahan graduated from the University of Puget Sound in 2007, working at a Seattle law firm around the same time. She worked at RPX, a patent firm, and in 2013 she founded Clear Access IP, a patent tech company, according to her LinkedIn profile. Okay. She completed a law degree at the Santa Clara University School of Law in 2014. Adam Phillip, the founder and managing partner of Aeon Law, A-E-O-N, the Seattle law firm where Ms. Shanahan worked, said he was impressed when she applied to be a paralegal in 2006. She had a willingness to learn and an abundance of common sense, he said. In 2011, Ms. Shanahan began dating Mr. Kranz, a tech investor in San Francisco. She told people that she had converted to Judaism during that time for the relationship. Okay. Ms. Kranz, or Mr. Kranz rather, bought a $2.7 million penthouse with views of San Francisco about a month before their wedding in August of 2014, according to property records. And that July, Ms. Shanahan, though, remember, they're getting married in August. That July, she met Mr. Brin at a yoga festival in Lake Tahoe, California, which is where Donald Trump met Stormy Daniels, just sort of pointing that out. 4 people with knowledge of the event said he had recently separated from Anne, what is this last name? Wojcicki, maybe? I can't pronounce it. Wojcicki, his wife at the time. Everyone was having problems. They all went to yoga because of this. Mr. Brin and Ms. Shanahan embarked on an affair weeks before her wedding to Mr. Kranz, the people said. Well, Mr. Kranz discovered the relationship when? Unfortunately for him, several days after he married Ms. Shanahan. When he saw texts between her and Mr. Brin on her phone, they said, tech does her in. He filed to annul the marriage 27 days after the wedding, court records show. Him and his $2.7 million penthouse. Oh, well. Mr. Kranz planned to list fraud as a reason for the annulment, the people said, but Ms. Shanahan was concerned that a fraud claim would jeopardize her ability to practice law, as it should. While negotiating with Mr. Kranz about their split, she threatened to harm herself, 3 people said, and so, instead of an annulment, Mr. Kranz agreed to a divorce without making a fraud claim. As part of their settlement, Ms. Shanahan was required to remove any evidence of Mr. Kranz from her social media accounts and pay him $20,000 in partial wedding costs and legal fees, court records show. Mr. Kranz did not respond to a request for comment. That is a little unusual, but okay. I mean, the timing's pretty bad. In an interview with People magazine last year, Ms. Shanahan said she started dating Mr. Brin in 2015. She recounted wandering Stanford University's campus with the billionaire and discussing quantum physics. I was living in a fairy tale, she said. It was magical. She was going from tech billionaire to tech billionaire. Well, millionaire to billionaire. Anyway, that's the fantasy. That's the fairy tale. Next up, becoming a philanthropist. Mr. Brin became Ms. Shanahan's entryway into the tech industry's upper echelons. The couple traveled the world, took trips on Mr. Brin's yachts, and stayed in the most elite camps at Burning Man. That's the important thing. The countercultural annual festival in the Nevada desert. They married in 2018 and had a daughter, Echo, that same year. They owned properties in Lake Tahoe, Los Altos, California, Montana, and Malibu, California, where Ms. Shanahan now spends much of her time. In 2019, Ms. Shanahan began building a foundation, Bia Echo, named for her daughter, or Bia? I don't know, B-I-A Echo, that hyphen Echo. It focuses on criminal justice and fertility longevity, because why not? And ice cream as well. Throw in the ice cream. Ms. Shanahan has said she struggled to become pregnant. She used more than $20 million from Mr. Brin for the effort, according to tax documents. To raise her profile, Ms. Shanahan hired Matthew Hiltzik, a publicist who has worked for Katie Couric and other high-profile women. Her goal was to become a famous philanthropist. An Italian famous philanthropist, like Mackenzie Scott, the former wife of the Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. 4 people familiar with Ms. Shanahan's plan said, there's a famous person. I want to be that. Okay. In 2020, Ms. Shanahan sold clear access IP to IPWE. That's capital I, capital P, lowercase W-E, like we, us, people, a patent technology firm in exchange for IPWE stock that was valued at more than $10 million. Two people familiar with the deal said IPWE filed for bankruptcy this year. Just wanted to let you know. Around the time of the sale, Ms. Shanahan and Mr. Brin learned that Echo was autistic, and so therefore now you're going to become active in that, right? Ms. Shanahan said that the diagnosis made her question the use of childhood vaccines. That's where the anti-vax stuff comes from. In 2021, she paid more than $200,000 for a lifestyle photographer to take her photos for a San Francisco magazine article called Nicole Shanahan is Fighting the Good Fight. According to documents viewed by the Times, Ms. Shanahan was photographed in the country with horses, talking about her goals of creating a healthy and livable planet. But she's still pretty much a, who the hell is this person? In the article, Ms. Shanahan said she had been sexually assaulted by an unnamed male coworker while working for RPX. The episode caused her to sink into a severe depression and ultimately give up law, she said. Daniel McCurdy, chief executive at RPX, said in a statement, by the way, that the company hadn't been informed of the claim before the article was published, and it had engaged a law firm to conduct an investigation, which was inconclusive, he said. And now, up to the point where her marriage crumbles. Brin and Shanahan found the coronavirus pandemic lockdowns challenging. 3 people close to the couple said. Among other things, they struggled with their daughter's autism diagnosis, the people said. And I'm sure that was very difficult with $145 billion in the bank. Ms. Shanahan began going out more without Mr. Brin. And, long story short, Shanahan threw herself a Studio 54-themed birthday party in New York. And Elon Musk showed up, a longtime friend of Mr. Brin's. And something, blah, blah, blah. They went off and did cocaine and ketamine. And guess what? Mr. Brin found out later that she had sex with Mr. Musk. And she also relayed the details to families, friends, and advisors. And, well, you see, they filed for divorce the next year. And anyway, the point is something vice president. Anyway, I thought you might find that interesting. There's more to investigate. And don't forget, Brandy Zadrozny addresses this at NBC News as well. Something to read over the weekend, just in case you're tired of Trump.
Radio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the morning with David Waldman.
I don't know. She's not super important. He's not super important. It's not necessary that you know what's going on, but it's weekend, and I have the feeling it will be the butt of a lot of jokes in the future. Hopefully she still remains irrelevant. But want some relevant news? Guess what? You're in luck. Justice Putnam is next with the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Stay tuned. We'll see you next week.